Good day, radio listeners. Welcome to this edition of the Pure Sex Radio program. We're so glad to have you here with us. My name is Jonathan, and we have a very special guest on the line with us. We have Anne Kerr from the TrueNorth Freedom Project. So, Anne, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, so I want Anne to be able to kind of unpack her story and just kind of how she's gotten into ministry and all that. But before we do that, I just want to let you all know, our listeners, as I do periodically, that we're a listener-supported program. And what that means is the only way that you're hearing our voices is because of faithful partners that have come alongside of us and decided to support this ministry. And folks, it's really cool because God is continuing to expand our reach. You know, we've got listeners in over 100 countries, and when we see these reports of where people are listening to this program, sometimes I'm absolutely flabbergasted because people are listening in countries that are closed, and people are listening to somehow getting access to this program in places that are very anti-gospel parts of the world. And so we're just grateful to those of you who are allowing us to bring light into very dark places. And so if you would like to come alongside and partner with us so we can continue to reach even more people with the good news of Jesus and his hope for freedom and purity, please just go to puresexradio.com and click on the donate link. Well, Anne, I'm really glad that we were able to make this connection work and be able to get you on the program because I just think it's really going to benefit our listeners. And so I want to just hand it off to you, and maybe just you can let our listeners just kind of know who you are, kind of where you've come from, a little bit about your story, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about how you got into the ministry that you're doing.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I'm a Southern girl. I grew up just outside of Atlanta in a big Catholic family. I met Jesus through some Protestant friends, actually, in high school, and had a great walk with Jesus, but a little bit on the fence at times. And I found through my college years that I loved Jesus, but I didn't really know how to walk with him, especially in authenticity. And that's something that over the last, 40 years, God's been showing me more of. But I'm grateful for my big family and a lot of love. One thing, my dad always said he wanted 12 children, and he only got 9.
Oh, my goodness.
What a bummer.
That's still a pretty full quiver.
Exactly. And, what it really said to me was I was wanted. And I internalized that, and I have clung to that. And, then as my understanding of God grew, I realized, wow, I was really wanted by God too. Like He created me intentionally. And I stayed in Atlanta. I went to Georgia Tech for college. I'm not an engineer. I'm about as far away from an engineer as you can imagine, but I did meet my husband there. And that was probably one of the best things that came out of my Georgia Tech degree. He was an architecture major, and we dated off and on for about 6 years and got married, and God gave us 3 wonderful children, and I began what I believe will always be my favorite job, which was I was blessed to be able to stay home with them. So for 23 years, that's what I did. I raised children and did the mom thing, and loved every minute of it.
Mm-hmm. So what was your understanding growing up when it came to, sexuality and all of those kinds of issues, growing up in your home, and just even kind of your experience of just going from childhood to adolescence to adulthood? What was the framework that you were given early on for sexuality?
Well, I think growing up Catholic, it's kind of interesting because I don't believe my parents, used any artificial birth control. So I'm sure they didn't. And so in that sense, I think sexuality was, in a sense, honored. I love the way the Catholic Church honors it like that, and that sex is a good thing. Now, in terms of what I learned about it, it was pretty minimal. I think probably similar to a lot of people in my generation. My mom had a talk with me about sex, but that was pretty much it. And then when I was in the 5th grade, I did see pornography for the first time, and it was very jolting and very interesting. And I was surprised by it. I was surprised by my interest. But even before that, as I look back, I remember, oh wow, I actually was intrigued with the National Geographic magazines and with the Sears catalog. And not that it was an obsession, but there was an interest there, and there were feelings that I didn't really understand. And of course, now I know those are very God-given natural feelings. And so I kind of just internalized all of that. And then I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, and so pornography was becoming a little more out in the open, I guess. And I did see it more places as I became a teenager. And again, didn't really have a framework for it. No one was talking about it. I was very intrigued with it. I would see it when I went to babysit sometimes. And so all of that kind of skewed a little bit. I think my view of sex and sexuality, I know it did. I know the enemy used it in very negative ways, because I realized now what I was seeing was not at all God's design. Mm-hmm. And so that sadly kind of set me up, I think, for some promiscuity in college. And again, I was kind of just trying to do that in isolation, when I say do that, just live the Christian life authentically. I wasn't really living authentically with other people. I was struggling with some sin and couldn't really find the words to talk with anyone about it. I think looking back, the enemy did put a lot of shame over my sexuality and even my body image, because of the things that I had seen in porn. It's very sad. It's very destructive. So my husband and I, we struggled some with sexual sin, and honestly, it was the only reason we ever broke up, was because we felt like, wow, we're Christians, but we can't seem to get this part right. And we didn't really understand why. So over 6 years that we dated, we broke up several times, and it was always because of that, because we're very compatible and we love each other very much. And then we got married, and, then God had other interesting things for us in terms of sexuality, which I know we're going to get into.
Yeah, so you had this great framework growing up of feeling wanted as a child, right? You felt included, right. You felt like you belonged, you felt like you were received. And then as sexuality begins to blossom and you are introduced to some things, and there's not a whole lot of explicit talk in your home about the topic and how do you address it, and then getting into college, it seems like you had this wonderful foundation of family embrace, but then that didn't maybe extend to a really robust education on this central aspect of your being, of being sexual, right? I mean, is that fair, or is that am I wrong?
Yeah, and no, I think that's very typical too of that era, and even the era that we live in now. Frankly, as I talk with a lot of women, I realize most people don't really have a real clear understanding of why we're even sexual, and what that looks like in the greater scheme of our walk with Jesus, and how he can use the longings that we have and the struggles that we have to lead us closer to him. So yeah, I think, you can't give away what you don't have. I think my parents probably gave me what they had, and maybe a little bit more. They probably tried, but sin is always crouching at the door, isn't it? There were things that went on in my childhood home that were not great either.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And so just seeing pornography various places, I think the hardest thing for me was not really being able to talk about it, because I was so filled with shame over my interest in it.
Yeah. Well, so you had this interest in it, but then you also talked about body image. Can you share a little bit about that? Because I think that's an extremely common thing, especially for women. I think it certainly exists in men, but it seems like it really maybe captures a woman in a different way than it does men in terms of body image. So can you share a little bit of that, especially for our female listeners?
Yes, it really does. And it's not just pornography. It is the way our culture objectifies the female body and holds up a certain standard that is not at all really, indicative of the culture, and it's certainly not honoring of the fact that God made every single one of us perfectly in His plan, in His design for our purposes that He had already ordained for our lives. So yes, I think Barbie dolls. I mean, obviously we could make a whole list of things, but I was just a normal girl growing up, but I saw pictures and displays and images of women that had a very certain body type. And then as my body began to develop, I realized I didn't look exactly like them. And I began to doubt even kind of the goodness of God. Like, why not? Because obviously to me that was what men wanted. That must be what they wanted, or they wouldn't put pictures like that in magazines.
Yeah.
And so when my body didn't develop quite the exact same way, and I didn't have a very clear understanding that my body was developing exactly the way God wanted it to, I think the enemy then seized that moment and began to plant doubt in my mind. And isn't that just like the Garden of Eden? Did God really say,
Right.
or surely God didn't mean this? I began to doubt in some ways the goodness of God. But then there was a mixture, because I began to enjoy some of the good feelings of, sexual activity in college. And so I began to realize that, so there's pleasure, there's really pleasure attached to this also. So I think it becomes a very toxic kind of mix in your mind if you don't have a real firm foundation and understanding of sexuality when all these other influences come in. I mean, even right now, my husband and I, there are several Hooters restaurants in our city of Atlanta, and sometimes guys will make a joke about a Hooters restaurant, and I said to my husband Greg the other day, I said, and I'm not trying to be really legalistic, but I said, I just don't think men really realize how much that messes with women.
Right.
It's degrading.
Well, it's kind of like, I think the way that men often carry our shame regarding our sexuality, it's very connected to performance. A man may be looking at pornography and going, I don't measure up to the stud, so to speak, in terms of performance. I think maybe for a woman, what I'm hearing you say is the shame is carried in her image, her appearance. And so, because I'm hearing a lot of shame connected with what you're talking about regarding body image. And maybe that's one of the ways that it manifests, and we don't realize the degree to which that is just rampant in our culture. Is we are imposing that shame earlier and earlier on young girls, to where if you don't measure up, and we're doing that to boys too, but I think maybe for boys it's more performance oriented, and for girls it's more image oriented. I don't know, I could be wrong, but it seems like that's kind of how it manifests. Yeah,
and it's not even just so much measuring up. That's part of it. I think that's maybe an entryway into some of that just wrong thinking, But girls today, they really, I think even more so than when I was growing up, they believe that their purpose, many of them, especially if they don't have a real godly view of themselves, they believe that their purpose in life is to please a boy.
Right.
Like some children and teens today that become sexually active, they don't even understand that God created sex to be pleasurable for both a man and a woman. And obviously within marriage, that's where the safety comes and the security comes. And that's where when you literally give your heart and soul away in sex, if you do it within marriage, it's safe there. If you do it outside of marriage, it's dangerous, it's vulnerable, you get hurt, you get wounded when that breakup happens. So anyway, it makes me sad because I see this culture, like with sexting and everything else, and boys are beginning to expect girls to just give them images of themselves.
Right.
It's sad that that's what happens. I think there's a lot of sexual confusion, in our culture, and I know the enemy's behind a lot of it today. So I did struggle with some of that. But then there was also a mixture of, once I began to experiment a little bit sexually, of just the power that comes with that.
Sure.
And there are powerful feelings associated with it, and there's a real bonding that was happening, in my mind with Greg. And again, that was meant for marriage, but I was experiencing all of that outside of marriage, and so it just began to. And so there was also shame over the sin. I think that's what I'm trying to get to. It wasn't just shame over my body. It was shame over the fact that I knew what we were doing was wrong. And I would confess. I didn't go so far as to confess to other people. Maybe that would have been a game changer for me. I don't know.
Now, what would you say to the person out there? Because I want our listeners to hear also, once you got married, and how you were able to process through, some of the shame, then the sin, and then getting married, and then having to, and then also even how that operated in terms of how you, when you started having kids, how did you, what messaging did you give to your kids regarding sexuality growing up and all of that? But how did you work through the shame element? Like, when did you start kind of maybe addressing that in an intentional way? Like, what were some of the things that happened that caused you to realize, oh, this is something I need healing from. I need to work through.
I think it probably did take me a lot longer than I wish it had. I think it probably affected me more than I realized. I probably didn't have a name for it early on, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when I did get married, and I really was with the love of my life, and there was security in that marriage, I think for me, God used that a little bit to begin to break away, some of that shame. And I also, just as I began to grow in spiritual maturity through the years, truth from Scripture, I've always loved Psalm 139, but just that idea of just the truth that God literally knit us together. He knew from before anyone even knew there would be a me. He knew what I would look like. He knew what my body would look like. He knew that it would be created specifically for my husband and our marriage. And it was exactly what my husband would need. But then I also, in the last few years, I've been learning more just about the bonding chemicals within sex. And so I realized, wow, so even if my body or anyone's body looks, different than what they wish it did, there's still the bonding that goes on in sex. And I think that's a beautiful gift from God within marriage, because what that says is whether I'm heavier or thinner or pregnant or, my skin begins to really sag, like, Greg is still going to be attracted to me. He is still going to want my body, and that's partly because of chemicals that God has given him in his brain that are paired with my body. And so it's just a beautiful design that God had really for sex, and the chemical processes that go on with it.
Yeah. And obviously, like you said, sin and the enemy, of course, are wanting to manipulate all of that in a way to get us away from that design. Multiple partners have body image issues, think that, God made a mistake, implant thoughts and ideas into your mind that get your desires shifted in a way that are outside of that, saying that, really, I'm biologically a man, but I want to be a woman. Just all those kinds of things that are the deceptive manipulation of a very real enemy that wants to take this good design that is for the sake of bonding a man and a woman for life and get it all distracted in all these other ways that create shame, division, depression, all kinds of things like that. So as you get further into your marriage, you have kids. Tell me a little bit about how you and your husband were wanting to, pass along, or just how did you raise your kids when it came to sexuality?
Well, we certainly were very affirming of their bodies. We named body parts from the very beginning. We didn't have the cutesy names for things.
Right.
So I think in many ways that was a good start. I wish I could say, wow, we just really knocked it out of the park. Like we just
Well, Anne, none of us can say that,
right.
Okay? Any parent that would tell me that, I'm thinking you're lying.
Oh, I know. And in some ways, I think I kind of patted myself on the back because I thought, well, I gave him a little more than, I was given growing up.
Right.
And so we definitely talked about things. I think we used the Brenna Jones series, God's Design for Sex. So we did have some good books that we read with the kids, starting when they were, 4 or 5 years old. There's one for that level, and so we use some of those resources just to have ongoing conversations. But looking back, I realized that we did miss a lot of opportunities, and partly because we did. Again, you can't give away what you don't have. So
sure, yeah.
Greg and I, neither one. I think growing up, as our kids were growing up, I don't know that either one of us really had a real solid understanding of God's good design for our sexuality, and I think we both carried a little bit of shame still as our kids were growing up. It's really only been probably in the last, 5 or 6 years that God has kind of opened up our eyes to some new things that now, are impacting my work.
Sure. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. We've got a few minutes left here, and so when did the transition start to happen to where you started feeling a call into this area of ministry? How did that happen?
Well, when my youngest left for college, I knew that my mothering years were, kind of coming to a close or taking a different direction, and I wanted to just see what God had for me. I began praying, and He opened up my eyes to the issue of human trafficking. So that was 8 years ago, and I began volunteering and then eventually working for an organization that was helping women get out of the life of prostitution in Atlanta. And we had a 24/7 hotline, and we would literally go and pick up a woman if she was ready to leave and to get into a program. And through that, my eyes were just really opened up to true brokenness. It was so sad seeing the woundedness of these women. They were wounded emotionally, often physically, certainly sexually. Mm-hmm. And I realized that we had to do something to stop sex trafficking. And I didn't know what it was, but I'm just very practical, and I just thought we can't keep doing the same thing expecting a different result. And so in my prayers, God began to just reveal some things to me about the fact that the people that were perpetuating it were broken also. So, and it's mostly men, and the buyers, whatever you want to call them, that are out there. They need rescue of a different kind, and they need a rescue of the heart, and they need to understand their own worth and their own value before they could ever begin to stop doing all that. And so in terms of that, I realized, well, pornography is really kind of the gateway to all of that. It's hard to get to that place of buying someone for sex without going through that gateway of pornography. And then as we began to look at pornography, we realized, wow, pornography it's just pervasive. It impacts so much of our culture and the sexualized culture in general. And it's causing, destruction in marriages and lives, and it's making parents ill-equipped to lead their own children through it. So we decided to deal with the issue of pornography, and because we know that the only freedom that can be found, true freedom, from any sort of enslavement or bondage, and pornography is bondage in many ways, is through Christ. And so we began to look at the church, and we thought, well, so what's the church doing about this, or how are they handling this, or what are they saying? And sadly, we just realized that a lot of churches don't know how to talk about sexuality in general, and they certainly don't really know how to talk about sexual sin or sexual brokenness. So we saw a real opportunity in the church to begin to help people talk about these things more normally, educate them a little bit, let the Holy Spirit do some work in their own lives, so that we can normalize these very important conversations about sex and sexuality, why we're even sexual, what do we do with these longings, what do we do with these desires, what if, everything related to it. Because really sexuality is one of the most common aspects of our being. Everyone is sexual. Yeah, and yet the church in general, or Christians in general, don't really seem to know how to talk about it.
So when you say we, were there some other folks alongside of you in these birthing stages of this ministry?
The man that started the organization, the rescue organization, he was so encouraging of my leaving that to start TrueNorth. And then my board chair, her name is Deb, and she has given so much to this work. And yes, there have been others. I have a huge prayer team that is behind me. In general, though, the work is, I'm the only employee right now with TrueNorth, and Deb is my board chair, so we do a lot of the work. But certainly a lot of encouragement from pastors in the area that we met with them, and they loved what we were doing, what we were attempting to do. It was huge. It's like, only if God was in it, would it even succeed? And so, yes, there have been many others.
So then, at first, what was kind of your main intention with TrueNorth? You're wanting to get information to pastors. You're wanting to just kind of create awareness. What has been the main emphasis? And maybe, as with any ministry, sometimes it changes along the way.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it has. We want to do all of that. I mean, we want pastors to understand this better, but we also realize that almost any real significant change, it kind of has to start at the ground level. And so we started looking for opportunities to reach people, just normal people, and my heart is really for women and moms. I mean, I have a heart for anyone who struggles in this area, but I see opportunity with the moms of today because I realize, wow, they've got these little ones in their houses and they're doing life with them. And if I can help them understand how to impart some things that I really could have used when I was younger and then things I could have used as I was raising my own children. So in a sense, our ministry is, I'm writing a book for younger women, so that's certainly going to be a big part of what we do. But then a little bit bigger emphasis is to really help pastors understand a little more of what's going on, that it's not just a list of what not to do. It's helping people understand how they were created and how that was a good design.
Yeah.
And God had good purposes for it. And of course, with any good thing, the enemy can help get it off track, but
Sure.
then God can even use that. Like, he's just limitless in what he can use to draw people to himself.
Well, Anne, we've got about a minute left, and I would love for our listeners to know how they can get in touch with you through TrueNorth. I'd also love for you to come back next time because we've got more to cover, I think, in terms of just maybe some insights and practical steps for folks who are struggling. So would you be willing to just give our listeners your website and some information on how they can connect with you?
Yes, thank you. Well, our website is TrueNorth, and then F as in freedom, P as in project.org, so TrueNorthFP.org. And we have a blog on there. We have lots of resources and things. And then I'd be happy to share my email if anyone wants to get in touch with me. It's just Anne, ANNEK, at TrueNorthFP.org. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll post that to our site, listeners, so that you can have access to that as well. But Anne, thanks for being with us. It's great to hear your story and just how God is such a redeemer and redeems our mess and turns it into a great message for others. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
And listeners, we're glad you were with us, and we look forward to having you back here again next time on the Pure Sex Radio broadcast.